All right, so Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. Turn there. Matthew chapter 5 and through verse 7, or not verse 7, through chapter 7, as you know. And we're starting in the early life of Christ, his early ministry, and there's a few things that you have to know about this. This was probably what he said in the Sermon on the Mount is probably what he taught, as he was a roving teacher in those early days. He'd probably go from place to place and teach something similar. We have something in the book of Luke also that is very similar to the Sermon on the Mount, and some people have tried to say that that's just kind of Luke's interpretation of what's going on, but I don't think so. I think probably that was a different occasion. He probably said a lot of the same things as many preachers do. You kind of use the same illustrations, and you kind of use the same
different areas,
yeah,
different people.
Different area, different people, same platform. But this was probably his proclamation of kingdom ethics, basically, is what's going on here. Now, this is one of the places that your overall theology, whether you're dispensational or covenant theology or new covenant theology, kind of affects how you understand the Sermon on the Mount. It's not just understanding dispensationalism and covenant theology and new covenant theology doesn't just affect your last days stuff. It affects a lot of other stuff, and this is one of the places that it affects, and we'll be talking a little bit about that. But let me ask you this question: how many of you have read the Sermon on the Mount and kind of you had a problem with it? You're like, what's going on here? Has this ever happened to you where you're reading the Sermon on the Mount and you're going, okay, how does this square with other things in the Bible, right? Now, first of all, it's
Works versus grace.
Works versus grace. Mm-hmm. If you don't forgive everybody, well, how does that work with Paul? And Paul says you're saved by grace alone through faith alone. How do you fit those two together? The relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, Jesus says...
I've always struggled with the one that says the pure in heart, and blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Well, wait a minute. That means that puts it back on me.
Right. Well, right, and those are some of the issues that we've had. Now, there are traditionally three issues that I want to go through this evening with you. And some sub-issues when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount. And these are the issues that people have a problem with. And that is, number one, what is Jesus' teaching in relation to the Old Testament? What is Jesus' teaching in relationship to the Old Testament? Is he raising the standard? Is he negating it? Is he clearing up misconceptions about the Old Testament? There are certain things that people have argued as far as this is concerned. The second thing is then what is the relationship between the teaching of Jesus and the rest of the New Testament? The rest of the New Testament. Jesus said, I didn't come to break one of the least of these laws. And if anybody relaxes one of the least of these laws, he shall be called least. And this happened before heaven and earth pass away. And Paul seems to say, hey, circumcision is nothing. It's all circumcision of the heart. Don't let anybody judge you in what you eat and what you drink and new moons and Sabbaths. It's all gone. Paul seems to say that Christ is the end of the law. in Romans chapter 10. So what's the relationship here? What's going on? What's Jesus' relationship with the Old Testament? What's Jesus' relationship with the New Testament? And the third question that we have to ask ourselves as far as the Sermon on the Mount is concerned is what's the relationship to the Christian life? CL there. What's the relationship with the Christian life? I mean, that's a big one. I mean, how do we understand? I mean, it seems to be part of the problem is that there isn't a problem. It seems to be so direct and forward. Like, don't take oaths, things like that. I mean, do we not join the military? Do we not go to court? Take the witness stand? There are many people who have said, no, you don't do that. And if that means I got to move away from society and start my own little place, then that's what it means, What does it mean as far as our ethics? It's like, am I caught on the horns of some dilemma between Paul being said, I'm saved by grace? I mean, should I seek to forgive everybody? Jesus said, if you don't forgive everybody from your heart, you will not be forgiven on the final day. Well, what if you miss one of them? Well, what's going on? Now, we understand there's no contradiction, but people have tried to solve these contradictions or solve these things in different ways throughout church history. So let's look at some of the different ways that people have tried to resolve these, particularly when it comes to the six antitheses. Okay, so I'm going to read these six antitheses to you. Places where Jesus said, but I say to you. Okay, so... And we're asking ourselves, what did Jesus mean here? And also another place, what did Jesus mean when he says, don't think that I've come to, look at verse 17. It says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth passes away, not an iota, a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes into his sixth antitheses here. I'm not going to be able to read all of it here with you, but I just want to go through some of it. Look at verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And then he goes on, and look at verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman with lustful intent has committed adultery already with her in his heart. Look at verse 31. But it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, anyone who divorces his wife except for on grounds of sexual immorality has committed adultery already. And in verse 33, again, you have heard that it was said of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven or its throne, or by the earth or its footstool. You have heard that it was said, in verse 38, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist one of those who is evil. But if he slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other one also. And then the last antithesis in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you. So you see there's a situation here where Jesus is saying, but I say to you. And the question is what's Jesus doing here? Is Jesus clearing up misconceptions and truly teaching us what Moses taught, what Moses wanted us to know? Is Jesus expanding Moses? Is Jesus supplanting Moses? What's going on? Those are our options. Well, let's look at kind of the history of this and the different views that are out there in regards to these questions. Okay, so don't forget these questions, because these views try to answer these questions. So the first view is what I'll call the Augustinian view. And the Augustinian view basically says that Jesus is clearing up misconceptions about Moses. Okay? He's clearing up misconceptions about Moses. He comes as the true interpreter of the Old Testament, like the prophets who came before, and Jesus as the greater prophet. He says, I'm going to tell you exactly what Moses really meant. All right, now let's do the medieval. We're going to do A and B on this one. The medieval view, A and B, is that Jesus isn't so much clearing things up, but he's expanding. He's saying that what Moses says is great, and what Jesus does is he says that's all good. We're still going to do all of that, but we're going to expand it. We're going to go with it a little bit. Now, as far as the relationship of the Christian life is that there's in medieval Catholic theology, there's what's called the lower and the higher. And so lower life is, you don't have to keep all of these if you don't want to, but the higher life about, not taking vows, those are for like monks and things like that, people who want to move away and set up their own commune and stuff like that. So there's the lower kind of echelon Christianity, and then there's the super Christianity. All right, and let's do the Lutheran view. The Lutheran view, A and B. And this is really kind of Luther. You're going to find out that Luther believed a lot of stuff that Lutherans don't believe. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. But Luther made a distinction between public life and private life. And he said in your public life, you might not necessarily be able to do all these laws. Somebody might drag you to court and you might have to take an oath. So you might not necessarily have to do this in your public life. But in your private life, you should strive to not take oaths, let your yes be yes, your no be no. So he made a distinction between your public life and your private life. Now, the other view that Lutherans developed as a result of this is that how this applies to kind of the Christian life is the application of law and gospel. Law and gospel. This was Luther's probably biggest, and Lutherans since then, biggest contribution to how we understand the Bible. As a matter of fact, there was a book that said, have you seen those 4 views book, like 4 views of eschatology, 4 views of this? There's lots of books. They say 4 views of the millennium, 4 views of law and gospel, 4 views of why the Israelites, 4 views on apologetics. There's all these 4, there's 4 or 5 views. They're good books. Well, one of these books, the point that I agreed with the most on the relationship between the Old and New Testament was done by a Lutheran. So in a way, I'm going to come back to this because I agree with Luther's idea of the difference between law and gospel. But basically, what he's saying here is that this is law, that this is law, and the idea of law is to drive you to your knees. So that this is God's perfect standard in his new kingdom, and that there's no way you can keep this. And what you're supposed to do with law, and you look at in the Old Testament, you look at the law, what was the law supposed to do? Drive you to Christ, right? Drive you to despair. I can't do it. Lord, help me. I need forgiveness. Well, here comes Christ, brings the new covenant and the higher law, and it's way even higher than the Old Testament law. And so he's saying that this is a law and gospel kind of dichotomy, that what this is just you look at it and you just realize, I can't do it. There's no way, and it's to drive you to grace. So that's the law and gospel hypothesis. All right, so the next one is the Anabaptist. The Anabaptist view of this is that Jesus is basically supplanting Moses. He's not even discussing Moses. He's supplanting Moses. Well, he might be discussing Moses, but who cares? It's irrelevant. Jesus comes along and says, I say to you. And then he gives a higher ethical kingdom on this. He says, I'm not clearing up Moses, I'm not expanding Moses. I say to you, this is what it is. And it basically supplants the law covenant of the Old Testament. The second view on this and how this relates to the Christian life is that it should be followed no matter what. So these are
Fundamentalists.
Yeah, very, very. Well, the Anabaptists that have survived today are like the Quakers and those people living in Pennsylvania, the Mennonites. They won't take public office. They won't vote. They won't do anything like that. They won't do anything where you have to swear an oath, because they say Jesus said don't swear an oath. I'm not going to swear an oath. That means I can't be in public office. If that means even in their marriages, they're kind of like, it's a little weird because they don't have any vows in their marriages. They just get if you want to get married, they get the two people together and they make them stand and sit together for a while. And if anybody feels led to say something, they can say something. And if anybody doesn't feel led to say anything, they don't. And after about 15, 20 minutes, they say, okay, you're married. No, nothing. Nothing. There's no vows at all. They would include oaths as vows as well. No vows. Jesus said anything other than this from the devil. So how do we do this? Interesting. All right. This brings us to the good stuff. All right. This brings us to the real controversy. Classic dispensationalists. The classic disp. And also, I would say, the hyper and the ultra. These are actually different camps of dispensationalism. So, but classic gave birth to hyper dispensationalism. Hyper dispensationalism gave birth to ultra dispensationalism. And when we went through our classes on dispensationalism way back a long time ago, I didn't even touch ultra because it's so far out there. But they look at the hyper dispensationalists as a compromise, as not going far enough with dispensationalism.
Do they still exist?
Yeah, they still exist. Hypers, yeah, they still exist. Hypers and ultras, yeah, they still exist. Classics don't as much. But the classic dispensationalist view is that this is for Israel. Only. And what Jesus attempted to do was to come and to establish a theocratic kingdom on earth, and that he was killed instead. And what he's talking about here is for Israel only, and it's put on the back burner until the millennium. And this is why these things are difficult for us to understand, because this is for Israel only. This isn't for us. This is for Israel. Pardon me, say, ask anything in my name, and it'll be done for you. And you asked, and you said, well, how did that not happen for me? I said, well, because it's not for you. It's for Israel, and it's going to be for the theocratic kingdom in the millennium. So when they ask anything in Jesus' name in the theocratic kingdom in the millennium, then they will get it. So
I have to wait then to get my Winnebago?
Yes, exactly. All right.
Okay.
Now let's talk then about some views that are up in the air that aren't nailed down. So these ones are pretty much nailed down as far as what these people believe about the Sermon on the Mount. There might be some differences here and there, but it's the general idea. And the first one is the Reformed. Reformed, or I'm going to also call it the covenant theology view. And then other dispensational views, like, where you guys all came from. The other dispensationalist views, I did too. So But yeah, I don't want to mention the last church on Cameron.
Sure,
That's
sure,
where
yeah.
that's why I didn't want to say that.
Those guys.
And then New Covenant theology. New Covenant theology. And actually, New Covenant theology and what's called progressive dispensationalism on this issue here, falls pretty much in the same line, okay? But these are a little up in the air. So these are a little bit kind of like running through the buffet with your plate and choosing which one you think is best, okay? So,
Salad bar.
yeah, kind of salad bar. Now you'll find Reformed people in covenant theology camp believing either the Augustinian view or part A of the medieval view. They would reject part B, but they're up in arms. You find different covenant theology people who believe different things about that. Some of them believe that what Jesus is doing is coming to be the best interpreter of Moses. Some of them believe that no, he's not really interpreting Moses, he's just expanding Moses. But they all believe this because of what they believe about covenant theology. And what covenant theology believes is that the Ten Commandments are God's highest moral standard. And that everything from then on, that Jesus doesn't come to make anything, well, he might come to make it higher, but he's not abrogating it in any way. He would not abrogate it in any way. Because that's God's highest standard, is the Ten Commandments. It might carry over, there might be better explanation, but other dispensationalists view, well, they wouldn't agree with this for Israel only. So if you look at somebody like John MacArthur, who actually borders kind of over here, or you look at Calvary Chapel, they're all dispensationalists. They would all kind of say, yes, the Sermon on the Mount applies to us. But how it applies is a little, they're not, I don't know, maybe a little of this, maybe a little of this, it's kind of a little up in the air. So they would disagree with this. Most dispensationalists that you run in today will disagree that the Sermon on the Mount is for Israel only. Okay, that they just would absolutely disagree that it's for Israel only. It applies today, and you'll find that they give sermons and stuff covering this section of Scripture and applying it. How they apply it, though, kind of breaks down between it should be followed no matter what and the law gospel thing. Okay. New Covenant theology basically is part A of Anabaptist. And basically it says that that what Jesus is doing is supplanting Moses. That Moses went up on his mountain and Jesus went up on his mountain. And that the relationship between Jesus and Moses is the relationship between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. He's not explaining, he's not expounding, he's giving new information. He is simply just giving he's saying this is the way it is in the New Covenant. He speaks of his own authority. He doesn't need to explain Moses. That's not his mission, is not to explain Moses. It's not his mission to expand Moses. His mission is to explain the New Covenant. Explain the New Covenant. Okay. Now, what do they believe as far as the relationship between the law and the gospel and how it should be followed? They believe basically, and this is my position, that it's a mixture between the B over here and the B here. Okay. That this is essentially law and gospel. What's being said here is law and gospel. That God's giving this law and you can't do it. You've gotta fall down on your knees. And the idea of law and gospel with Luther is that you don't go back to the law to learn how to be a better Christian. Because if you look into the law and you think you're a better person today than you were yesterday, Luther said you're a hypocrite. That's not the relationship. You don't. Now, that's where Luther and NCT, which a lot of these people, well, all of them are all Calvinists. So, but they basically would disagree that you go back to the law for your schoolmaster to teach you how to be a better Christian. So that's out of it. We follow the new covenant ideals.
Covenant theology does, however.
Covenant theology does
Yeah.
believe that. I'm going to approach on that in just a second, because we're going to review real quickly what covenant theology is. But also that if you do careful exegesis of these passages, they're not quite as... They would say of the Anabaptists that the Anabaptists didn't really understand the Sermon on the Mount, as far as like things like not being able to take oaths and things like that. They would say that the Anabaptists they didn't do their Bible exegesis right. And if they would have done their Bible exegesis right, they would have certainly understood that you can take oaths and that you can have marriage vows. So they agree with this, but they also agree that you can take oaths is if you exegete the Bible correctly. Okay, and so they're over here to some degree with these guys as well. All right, any questions about this before I erase it?
Why do they say that you can? What's their argument for you can take those?
Well, I will look at that when I get to that particular passage. I will actually we'll go through this and talk about each one of these actually, and what the best explanation for each one is.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Any questions about this? You all going to remember this next week, because you're going to be tested next week.
Got my notes, as long as it's open book, I'm good.
Always open book. Maybe. I shouldn't say always. All right. There's one more thing that I want to go through here before we get to these 6 antitheses and how this relates in the Christian life. And boy, what's going on here? Is Jesus, what's Jesus doing with these antitheses? And that is, I really want us to understand the nature of covenant theology and dispensational theology, just as a reminder. Okay, like what's the basic idea? Now dispensational theology, we've beat that to death. But let me just say this. Dispensational theology hinges on the fact that they keep Israel and the church separate. Okay? So separate, and this is the big deal, that the church is in Israel, Israel isn't the church. So separate, in fact, that God still owes Israel certain things by way of covenant that's not fulfilled in the church. Okay, that's the big deal about it. This is why this is their whole eschatology. This is why they're always looking at Israel. This is why they're always talking about what's going on over there. It's because they believe that the covenants that God made to Israel are not fulfilled in the church, that they are to be fulfilled later in the millennium. This is why, and then they have in conjunction with this, I would call it hyper-literalism. So in the Old Testament, when it says, oh, there's going to be this big temple, they say, well, it's got to be the temple in the millennium. God promised them a temple. There's going to be a temple, despite the fact that the New Testament over and over calls us the temple of God. And so they gotta have their land, they gotta have their temple, they've got to have all that God, not just that this might happen as a result of prophecy, or this might not happen as a result of promise, but that God owes them this as a result of God's covenant in the Old Testament that's not fulfilled in the church. Okay, so what's covenant theology? Now these guys, they fight, there's 7 dispensations and different covenants, and they're all separate. Remember, these are separate. These are separate people. It's a blockchain. It's separate. You can remove one and put it up here and do another one. And this is why when you're reading this stuff and you're looking at their charts, they always put the church in parenthesis, because the church is not part of God's plan in Israel's economy. Okay, that's why the church has got to be taken up off the earth in order for, you've noticed that there's no verses on a pre-tribulational rapture, right?
Right.
Right.
Agreed.
Why do they believe it then? Well, they believe it because what they believe about the relationship between the church and Israel. They do not believe that these two things are together, and so God still has to deal with Israel, and in order to properly deal with Israel, they've got to get the church out of the way. So this is the basis of their idea. So
Presuppositions.
think of this as like if I'm starting a meal, okay? So this is one of my favorite analogies as far as this is concerned. And like, I've got Jason over to my house, and I'm like, I got this meal prepared for Jason, and it's roast beef or something like that, and it's cooking in the crock pot, and Jason calls me. He decides not to go, and then James comes over, and I go, no, I'm going to save this roast beef for Jason when he comes over, and I'm going to make you a completely new dish. Not, you don't get any of this.
I like this.
You're going to get something else. You're going to get, I don't know, cotton candy or something like that, So that's the idea, is that there's something, this is over here, it was made for a specific audience, it's not for you, and you get none of it. And now I'm going to do this meal for you, and neither the twain shall meet. Okay, covenant theology, on the other hand, to use this analogy, believes it's more like a lasagna. That each stage of God's dealings is like a layer of lasagna. So, let's say I'm going to have a party at my house, and I'm inviting people to come over, but some people come. So I invite some people a little early to give them a little sample. So, like, Jennifer comes over, I say, "Hey, you like noodles?"
Yes.
And so I give you some noodles, right?
And cheese.
And then you say, James is going to be here for a minute. Be here in a minute.
I have
James,
meat and the cheese.
James comes over, and I give him a little meat and cheese. And then Jason comes over, and then it's meat and cheese and lasagna, the whole thing. It works. Okay, so that's the whole thing.
How come it works? You know.
Well, then in the end, you all get it. You all get everything. It's just that it was all kind of poured out a little bit. So instead of being separate, it's more like an accordion or one of those.
They're all connected.
Slinky.
Yeah, a slinky. And here's the big deal about covenant theology.
Post-it notes. They're all attached.
Yeah, but you can't separate it out. Here's the big deal about covenant theology, is that God is really only working in history in one covenant. The covenant, they call it the covenant of grace.
Say that again. God is only working.
Grace, the covenant of grace. Right.
God
God is only working out one covenant. He's got one plan, and he's got one covenant. You need to move or close that a little
I might
bit?
have to, but it'll be all right.
Okay. So one covenant, one plan. Okay? So he established this covenant of grace after Adam broke the covenant of works in the garden. And so he said, I'm going to get this covenant of grace with Adam afterwards, and he makes the promise, Genesis 3:15, which they think is a covenant, and that everything is working out in this one covenant. So one covenant, one plan. Well, what's the problem is when you come to the new covenant, is it really a new covenant? I don't know. Okay, it's new in that it's repackaged. It's like it's got extra stuff on it. I threw some new stuff in there, but really everything's down. Now, this brings them to why they believe certain things they believe. So these people are disconnected, these people are more connected. So they want to bring as much of the Old Testament into the New Testament as possible. So they're maximalists. They're like as much of the New Testament into the Old Testament as possible. These people are like the least. It's a different covenant. Different covenant, different laws. Covenant theology, it's like it's as most that we can get over there. And as a result of that, they believe things today, still the 10 Commandments as God's covenant law, particularly the 4th commandment. That's the big deal. The 4th commandment. Keep the Sabbath. Now they've changed it from Saturday to Sunday. But they believe in covenant theology, they believe that God still wants you to keep the 10 Commandments, including the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment is not abrogated in Christ, that it is still part of what you have to do. This is also why many of them believe in infant baptism. Not all of them. A lot of Reformed Baptists are covenant theologians as well. But infant baptism is based on this idea as well. Because how do you treat children in the Old Testament? Children of the covenant. Do children of the covenant receive the sign of the covenant?
Circumcision.
Yeah, they receive the sign of the covenant. So we're going to keep as much as possible. So in the New Testament, are children mentioned or not mentioned really one way or the other? So because they're not mentioned and because we're going to try to keep it as close to the Old Testament way as possible, well, of course we baptize our children. I mean, I know there's no verses on it, but you see there's no verses on this either, but it's how you view the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you're trying to keep as much as possible, and there's nowhere where it says don't do it, well, if they circumcise their infants and that was the sign of the the covenant in the Old Testament, then of course we baptize our children in the New Covenant. We're not saying it saves them, the Presbyterians. I'm not saying it saves them. We're not saying it regenerates them. We're not Catholic, but we are saying that we do baptize them as part of that outward covenant, just like in the Old Testament they received part of the sign of the outward covenant. Okay, got it? See? So this is lasagna. Say you still, this isn't a new meal. This is all the elements put together into one meal. So you still get all the things that are happening. So you know, if we started out with noodles with you, then meat with you, then cheese with you. Well, when we get to you, it's not, well, it's meat and not cheese and not noodles. It's everything. It's all of it. Okay? So, one covenant, one plan. Many covenants, many plans. Different covenants, different plans. So, different covenants, different plans. Okay? Covenant theology, one covenant, one plan. Along comes New Covenant theology, which is what I am. I don't believe you. Now, I'm closer to these people on several important levels. These people do believe that the church fulfills Israel. These people do believe that the church is the true Israel of God. So I'm closer in many respects with these people. Most Reformed people are. However, I'm different enough, and New Covenant theology is different enough that it's made people over here in covenant theology upset. Because we believe the fourth commandment is fulfilled in Christ and that the 10 commandments aren't the highest law, that Jesus brings the highest law. Okay. So what's the amalgamation of the two? Well, it's not real. So we don't like saying it's an amalgamation. We don't like saying, well, we got some good stuff from over here and we got some good stuff from over here. And boy, when NCT kind of came out, we said, look, we are going to go from strict exegesis. We really want it to be an exegetical system, and where these people are right, we want to say they're right, not disagree with them just because we disagree with them, vice versa. We don't want to do that. So NCT, New Covenant Theology, said one plan, for sure. These people are right. God hasn't had separate plans for separate covenants. It's only been one plan of God throughout the ages, but expressed through different covenants. So one plan, different covenants. So over here, we would agree that these aren't the same covenants, that the old covenant is not the same as the new covenant, that the covenant with Israel is not the same as the covenant with Abraham. The Mosaic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant are not the same covenant. But we don't believe that they're different plans, that these are all strung together to achieve the same goal, which is our redemption and God's glory. Okay. So this is kind of where we make both people upset. So I would say that Israel is not the church. Israel was never the church of God, any more than the Lions Club is any more than the Lions Club could be considered the Navajo Nation. Okay, it's a different thing. Institutionally, it's different. There might be a lot of Navajos at the Lions Club, but it's a different institution altogether. Okay. However, the church, Israel's not the church. However, the church is the true Israel of God. I believe that. That's what the New Testament would say. The church is the true Israel of God. It is everything that Israel was supposed to be. It is everything that Israel pointed to. So you can see now, this doesn't affect our eschatology, right? This affects how we understand the Bible, right? I mean, how do we go when we look at the Bible? One last amendment over here that I forgot to get to, and that is that in covenant theology, they have, and this is something you need to know, 3 uses of the law. Now, I might not enumerate them right. 1, 2, and 3. So there are 3 uses of the law. And by the law, they mean the 10 Commandments and the Old Covenant. Okay, because the Old Covenant really is the New Covenant. The New Covenant is really the Old Covenant, right? It's just packaged differently. 1 covenant, 1 plan. So what are the 3 uses? And that is to drive a person to Christ, now on that one, so far so good. Okay, what's the second use of the law? Does anybody remember?